Kim Taehyung, one of the most beloved members of BTS, known for his humility and generosity, has always believed that success only has meaning when shared. But behind the glitz and glamour of the stage, few people know that he invested part of his fortune to build a hospital in South Korea, a place meant to treat everyone with dignity regardless of their financial status. One day, driven by a gut feeling and some concerning reports, Taehyung decided to visit his own hospital incognito. Disguised as an ordinary patient, he walked through the reception doors expecting to see empathy and professionalism. What he found, however, shocked him to his core. In charge of the emergency ward was an arrogant doctor, Dr. Min Junho, who abused his power, treating patients with contempt, humiliating those who needed help the most, and cherry-picking who deserved to be seen. What Dr. Min didn't know was that among the people he was mistreating stood the true owner of the hospital. Taehyung watched everything in silence, restraining his indignation. But how long would he stay quiet? How would the story end? Stay with us until the end to find out. Oh, and before we continue, tell us where you're watching this from. We love hearing from you and always read the comments. Taehyung sat in his office, gazing out of the large glass window. Below, the bustling streets of Seoul shimmered with life, cars sped by, and people hurried along, their lives intertwined without ever truly noticing each other. He had achieved so much: fame, fortune, and respect. But he had never forgotten what it felt like to be treated as a nobody. That was why he decided to invest in building a hospital not just as a charity project, but as a model institution where everyone would be treated with dignity regardless of their financial status. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Official reports claimed everything was running smoothly, but Taehyung had started receiving anonymous complaints. This was unacceptable. There was only one way to find out the truth. He would go there himself, disguised as a regular patient, and see things with his own eyes. That evening, Taehyung slipped into a simple outfit, a worn-out hoodie and faded jeans, and rode to the hospital on his old bicycle. When he walked through the glass doors, no one recognized him. The global superstar, adored by millions, was now just another face in the crowd. He approached the reception desk, where a tired-looking woman typed away on her computer without glancing up. Taehyung waited patiently. "Good evening. I'd like to schedule a consultation," he said softly. The receptionist finally looked at him, her gaze scanning his simple clothes. Her expression turned impatient. "Name?" she asked curtly. "Taehyung," he replied. She raised an eyebrow and typed into the system. "Insurance?" "I'd rather pay in cash," he said. She rolled her eyes, sighed, and handed him a small slip of paper. "Wait your turn. It's going to take a while." Taehyung took the paper without complaint and walked to the waiting area, sitting down between an elderly man with a pained expression and a mother holding a feverish baby. As he sat there, he began observing everything around him. The desperate young mother held her sick baby, the child visibly burning with fever, his tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. The mother, exhausted and on the verge of tears, stood up and approached the receptionist. "Please, my baby is very sick. He needs a doctor now," she pleaded. The receptionist didn't even glance up. "Ma'am, I told you already. You need to wait your turn." "But he's getting worse," the mother cried. The receptionist sighed, her irritation obvious. "If you're so worried, maybe you should take him to a public hospital. Here, we follow rules." Taehyung narrowed his eyes. Then on his other side, he saw an elderly man clutching his chest, breathing heavily, wincing as he tried to call for a nurse. A young nurse walked past him without stopping, only giving him a brief glance before saying, "Sir, I can't stop everything for every little pain. Just wait your turn." The elderly man groaned in pain, doubling over slightly. Taehyung felt his fists clench. No one should be treated this way. He lifted his gaze and saw a man in a tailored suit walk past the reception desk. He didn't need a number. He didn't need to wait. The staff smiled at him and quickly made way. "Dr. Min is expecting you, sir. You can go right in," the receptionist said sweetly. Taehyung watched the hypocrisy unfold. The rich were treated like kings, while those who needed help the most were ignored. He felt his jaw tighten but took a slow breath. He needed to see more before acting. After a few minutes, Taehyung stood up and walked back to the reception desk. "Excuse me," he said calmly. The receptionist looked at him with annoyance. "Yes." Taehyung gestured discreetly toward the mother with the baby and the elderly man clutching his chest. "They seem to need urgent help. Are you sure there's nothing that can be done?" The receptionist frowned, irritated. "I already told you. Everyone has to wait their turn. Those are the rules." Taehyung remained silent for a moment, his dark eyes analyzing the situation. "Rules can be broken when a life is at risk," he said softly. The receptionist huffed. "And what makes you think you know more than the doctors?" Taehyung didn't answer right away. He just gave a small smirk, shook his head slightly, and walked back to his seat. He had already seen enough. This hospital was not what he had envisioned. Something was deeply wrong, and he was going to fix it. What Taehyung didn't know yet was that in just a few minutes, Dr. Min Junho, one of the most arrogant doctors in the hospital, was about to do something so unacceptable that Taehyung could no longer just sit and watch. It was time to act. But first, he needed to see with his own eyes just how deep the corruption ran. The hospital buzzed with noise. The reception area was packed and nurses rushed back and forth, trying to manage the overwhelming workload. Amidst this chaos, one man walked as if he were above it all, Dr. Min Junho. Tall, with perfectly styled hair and cold, sharp eyes, he wore a pristine white coat and held an expensive cup of coffee, strolling through the corridors without acknowledging the patients around him. To him, they were just numbers. A desperate scream echoed in the reception area. The mother with the feverish baby ran toward the doctor, clutching her child in her arms. "Doctor, please? My baby is burning up. He needs help now." Dr. Min paused mid-stride, his eyes lazily scanning the woman from head to toe. His disgusted expression was like someone who had just stepped on something unpleasant. He rolled his eyes, took a slow sip of coffee, and then spoke. "If he's sick, then wait like everyone else. This hospital is not a daycare." The mother froze, shocked by the doctor's cruelty. "But he could be seriously ill. He's getting weaker." The doctor sighed impatiently, leaning slightly toward her. "Listen carefully. Do you think you're the only person with problems here? If I stopped everything for every kid with the flu, this hospital would go bankrupt." Taehyung, sitting in the waiting area, felt his blood boil. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched slightly, but he remained outwardly calm. Inside, his indignation was growing by the second. Dr. Min kept walking as if the scene had never happened. Two nearby nurses exchanged uneasy glances, but neither dared to speak up. Taehyung noticed something crucial at that moment: fear. The staff knew what kind of person Dr. Min was, but no one had the courage to confront him. The mother returned to her seat, now silently crying as she held her child close. Taehyung glanced at the elderly man beside him, who was still clutching his chest, his breathing labored. "Sir, are you okay?" Taehyung asked gently. The man forced a tired smile. "I've been through worse. I just have to wait." Taehyung closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He was now seeing firsthand what people had warned him about. And now he was certain that something had to change. A few minutes later, a young man with a deep cut on his hand entered the reception area. He was holding a blood-soaked cloth against the wound, his expression a mix of pain and urgency. "Please, I need help," he said. The receptionist nodded casually and directed him to Dr. Min's office. Taehyung leaned forward slightly in his seat, curious to see how the doctor would handle this situation. The young man stepped inside the consultation room, but just seconds later, Dr. Min's voice rang through the corridor, loud and mocking. "Are you serious? You came here for that?" The hospital went silent for a moment. The young man hesitated. "Doctor, it's bleeding a lot and it really hurts." Dr. Min let out a sarcastic laugh. "That's just a scratch, kid. Put some alcohol on it and go home." Taehyung watched with a cold, unreadable expression. The young man paused, clearly humiliated. Dr. Min waved him off impatiently. "There are people dying in here and you expect me to waste my time on a little cut?" The boy lowered his head, embarrassed, and walked out without receiving proper treatment. As he passed, Taehyung stood up and approached him. "Let me see your hand," he said. The young man looked up, surprised. "Who are you?" Taehyung gave him a calm, reassuring smile. "Just someone who cares." He took a clean handkerchief from his pocket and helped press it against the boy's wound. Across the room, Dr. Min watched the scene with a mixture of irritation and amusement. He had no idea who was standing in front of him. And if he did, he would have been far more careful with the words he was about to say. What Dr. Min didn't know was that among the patients he was treating with such disrespect stood a man who could change his life forever. And the moment of truth was fast approaching. The hospital continued to buzz with murmurs, hurried footsteps, and the muffled sound of keyboards clacking at the reception desk. Taehyung remained seated, seemingly calm, but inside, a fire was beginning to burn. He had seen enough. The negligence, the contempt, the coldness. Dr. Min Junho, the doctor in charge of that wing, acted as if he were above everything and everyone. To him, patients were nothing more than inconveniences, and each consultation seemed like a tedious obligation. But he still didn't know who he was dealing with. In this hospital, the name Kim Taehyung meant nothing to him. And that was about to change. After a long wait, Taehyung's name was finally called. "Next patient, Taehyung," the receptionist said, glancing at the form but not bothering to ask for his last name. He stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and walked toward Dr. Min's office. Upon entering, he found the doctor sitting behind his desk, typing on his computer without even looking up. The office was clean and minimalistic, but it felt cold and impersonal. Dr. Min was typing with evident boredom and, without looking at Taehyung, muttered, "So, what's the problem?" Taehyung studied him for a moment before answering calmly, "I've been feeling extreme fatigue and muscle pain. I'd like a full checkup." The doctor finally lifted his gaze and looked at Taehyung for the first time. His eyes scanned Taehyung's simple clothing, the old hoodie, the worn-out jeans, his composed posture. Dr. Min frowned as if he were analyzing someone who clearly didn't belong there. Then he smirked slightly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Where are you from?" Taehyung raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" Dr. Min leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Because hospitals like this aren't for just anyone." Silence filled the room. Taehyung didn't move. His expression remained neutral. He had been through many things in life. He had heard all kinds of prejudice, had been judged by appearances, and had been underestimated countless times. But this was the first time someone had told him this inside a hospital that he himself had built. Dr. Min sighed, still holding on to his smug expression. "All right, let's get this over with." He picked up his stethoscope with obvious reluctance, as if he were about to perform a completely unnecessary task. "Take a deep breath," he said. Taehyung complied. The doctor barely bothered to listen properly. Then he asked a few basic questions, not paying much attention to the answers. In less than 3 minutes, he was already grabbing his pen to fill out the medical form. "You don't have anything serious," he said, tossing the paper onto the desk. "Take some painkillers and get some rest." Taehyung glanced at the form, then back at the doctor. "That's it?" Dr. Min leaned forward, clearly bored with the conversation. "That's it? What if it was something serious?" "You didn't run any tests, didn't ask for my medical history," Taehyung pressed. The doctor let out a short, dry laugh. "Look, buddy, I see dozens of people every day. I know when someone has something serious and when they're just dealing with common fatigue." Taehyung stayed silent for a moment, crossing his arms. "Could you explain to me exactly what's wrong with me?" Dr. Min rolled his eyes. "I already told you. You're fine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important patients to see." Taehyung remained seated, his gaze locked on the doctor. "More important patients?" The doctor let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly annoyed at Taehyung's persistence. "Yes, people who actually need my attention." That was when Taehyung fully realized that Dr. Min wasn't just being rude. He genuinely believed that some lives were worth more than others. And this wasn't just a bad attitude problem, it was a moral failure. Taehyung stood up slowly and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked at the doctor one last time. It was a calm but piercing gaze. Dr. Min noticed and raised an eyebrow, confused. "What?" he asked, irritated. Taehyung gave a slight smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. "Thank you for your time, doctor. I hope you treat the other patients with more respect than you treated me." The doctor let out a short, amused chuckle. "Oh yeah? And who are you to lecture me?" Taehyung didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. But before he could take more than a few steps down the corridor, a nurse quietly grabbed his arm. "Sir, I'm so sorry about what happened in there," she whispered, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. Taehyung turned to her, his gaze curious. "Is it always like this?" The nurse lowered her head, ashamed. "Yes, but no one dares to challenge him. He's untouchable." Taehyung remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing everything. He already knew what he needed to do, but there was still one more piece of the puzzle missing. He needed to gather more proof before making his move. Taehyung had seen enough. This wasn't just arrogance, this was a broken system that needed to be fixed. And he was about to do something that no one expected. Taehyung walked down the hospital corridor in silence, his expression neutral but his thoughts burning. What he had witnessed that night wasn't just individual arrogance, it was a system corrupted by indifference. He now fully understood why the reports he had received described the hospital as a place where the poor were ignored and mistreated. But there was still more to uncover. He didn't want to act on impulse alone. He needed more proof. So, before leaving, he decided to dig a little deeper. He headed toward a secluded area of the hospital where employees took their breaks. If anyone truly knew what was happening inside these walls, it was the lower-level staff, nurses, receptionists, and technicians who worked directly with patients every day. Taehyung stopped beside a slightly open door where he could hear muffled voices inside. Nurses were speaking in hushed tones, but their words were filled with frustration. "Dr. Min humiliated another patient today," one of the nurses said. "Again, another side. He always does. But who dares report him? Management protects him." Taehyung narrowed his eyes. A younger nurse spoke up. If anyone complains, he finds a way to get back at them, cuts their hours, gives them impossible shifts, bad performance reviews. The conversation continued, but one detail caught Taehyung's attention: management protected Dr. Min. He felt his jaw clench slightly. The problem wasn't just one arrogant doctor, it was something bigger. He stepped forward, revealing himself to the employees, who immediately fell silent upon seeing him at the door. They didn't recognize him yet, but they were clearly surprised to see a patient there. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt," Taehyung said, his voice calm but firm. The silence lingered. Then one of the nurses gathered the courage to speak. "Sir, you heard everything?" Taehyung nodded slowly. "I did. And I want to understand more about what's happening in this hospital." The staff exchanged uncertain glances. "But who are you?" one of the nurses asked. Taehyung didn't answer immediately. He knew it wasn't time yet to reveal himself. "I'm just someone who believes that people should be treated with dignity," he said. The first nurse bit her lip, hesitated for a moment, and then finally decided to trust him. "This goes way beyond Dr. Min," she said. Taehyung crossed his arms, listening attentively. "Management only cares about the numbers. They don't care if patients suffer as long as the reports show high efficiency. And Dr. Min, he's one of the doctors who bring in the best numbers." Another nurse nodded in agreement. "Exactly. He keeps the hospital's numbers high because he rushes through cases. If a patient complains, he ignores them. If a test should be run, he skips it to save time." Taehyung felt his stomach tighten. So that was it. It wasn't just a matter of ego, there was an entire system enabling this behavior. If he really wanted to change things, firing one doctor wouldn't be enough. He would have to bring down the entire corrupt structure. After speaking with the staff, Taehyung returned to the waiting room, observing the patients who were still waiting. An elderly woman was still sitting there, clutching her purse after hours of waiting. The young man who had been humiliated by Dr. Min was still there too, pressing a dirty cloth against his wounded hand, too afraid to ask for help again. The mother with the feverish baby was sitting in the same spot, rocking her child in her arms, exhausted and silently crying. Taehyung felt his chest tighten. He couldn't let this continue. He had seen enough. It was time to act. Before leaving the hospital, Taehyung walked up to one of the security guards. "I'd like to speak with the hospital administrator," he said. The guard frowned, confused. "About what?" Taehyung gave a small, enigmatic smile. "He's going to want to hear me out." The guard hesitated but picked up the phone and made the call. A few minutes later, Taehyung was led into a conference room where the hospital's chief administrator was waiting for him, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression, sitting with his arms crossed. "What do you want?" the administrator asked, clearly impatient. Taehyung walked forward slowly, sitting down at the table with a calm but firm posture. He locked eyes with the administrator before finally speaking. "My name is Kim Taehyung." The room fell into absolute silence. The administrator froze, his face paling slightly. The guards around them exchanged confused glances. Taehyung crossed his arms and continued. "And I am the owner of this hospital." The administrator swallowed hard. Taehyung's voice remained calm but unwavering. "It seems we have a serious problem here, and I intend to fix it. Right now." The administrator felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Taehyung was about to change everything, and no one was prepared for what was coming next. The conference room fell into absolute silence. The hospital administrator, a man used to dealing with bureaucracy and numbers, felt his breath grow heavy. He never expected that on this night, a simple-looking man would sit in front of him and say the words he had just heard. "Kim Taehyung, the owner of the hospital," he finally muttered, disbelief etched on his face. Taehyung, calm and composed, gave a slight nod. "Yes." The security guards exchanged looks. A nurse who had been standing in the room covered her mouth in shock. The administrator tried to regain his composure, adjusting his collar. "Well, Mr. Taehyung, if I had known you were here, we would have ensured a more appropriate level of care." Taehyung narrowed his eyes, his expression turning cold. "And why would I need special treatment?" The administrator swallowed hard, realizing he had just exposed himself. I just meant that some people here receive better treatment than others." Taehyung cut him off, his voice firm. "Exactly." The administrator fell silent. Taehyung leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I saw everything. I saw how humble people are treated here. I saw the disregard for patients who need help the most. I saw Dr. Min humiliating a desperate mother and denying care to an injured young man. I saw employees afraid to report abuse because they know they'll face retaliation." The administrator began to sweat, struggling to maintain his facade. "Mr. Taehyung, I understand your concerns, but we have to be realistic. Dr. Min is one of our most efficient doctors. He keeps the numbers high and Taehyung raised a hand, cutting him off. Numbers? His tone was sharp and cutting. You think numbers are more important than human lives? The administrator opened his mouth, but no words came out. If your hospital maintains high numbers at the cost of human dignity, then it has completely failed. The nurse, who had been silent until now, finally gathered the courage to speak. He's right. Everyone here knows what Dr. Min does, but no one dares report him. We've tried, but we're always silenced. Taehyung turned to her, his expression filled with respect. That ends today. The administrator stood frozen, feeling the weight of Taehyung's words. Taehyung slowly stood up, his presence commanding the room, and looked directly at one of the security guards. Bring Dr. Min here. Now. A few minutes later, the doors to the conference room swung open. Dr. Min walked in with confident strides, his face still full of arrogance. Why the hell was I called in at this hour? He grumbled, looking around. Then his eyes landed on Taehyung. He frowned, clearly confused. Who is this? He asked the administrator. The man hesitated for a second before answering tensely. He's the owner of the hospital. Dr. Min froze completely. The color drained from his face. What? Taehyung crossed his arms and stared directly at him. So, you're the great Dr. Min? The doctor was still trying to process what was happening. Taehyung didn't wait for him to respond. I saw everything. I saw how you treat patients. How you ignore those who need help. How you humiliate vulnerable people just because you can. Dr. Min tried to chuckle, though his voice sounded tense. Look, I'm just doing my job. I'm not here to babysit people. Your job. Taehyung repeated, leaning in slightly. Your job is to care for people, not treat them like garbage. Dr. Min lost his smirk, now visibly irritated. I'm an excellent doctor. My numbers prove it. Taehyung shook his head slowly. If your numbers are so good, then why does everyone here fear you? The doctor stiffened, unable to answer. Taehyung turned to the administrator. Dr. Min is fired. Effective immediately. The room fell into stunned silence. Dr. Min stepped forward, shocked. You can't do this. Taehyung held his gaze steady. I can. And I did. The doctor let out an angry growl, but the security guards were already beside him, ready to escort him out. Before he was removed, Taehyung gave him one final warning. And if I ever hear of you working at another hospital and treating patients this way, I will make sure you never practice medicine again. Dr. Min was dragged out of the room, humiliated and defeated. After he was gone, Taehyung turned to the hospital administrator. The changes start now. The employees in the room looked at him with hope in their eyes. I want an anonymous reporting system for abuse inside this hospital. I want every employee to go through empathy and patient care training. I want patients to be treated with dignity no matter their financial status. The nurse smiled, her eyes welling with tears. Is this really possible? Taehyung smiled back. Yes. And we're going to do it together. The administrator, realizing resistance was futile, finally nodded in agreement. A revolution inside the hospital had begun. In the days that followed, the hospital corridors felt lighter. Patients who were once ignored now received proper care. Employees who once lived in fear of retaliation now worked with motivation. The mother with the feverish baby who had been humiliated days before returned to the hospital and finally received the care she needed. The young man with the injured hand was treated with care and respect. And the staff, inspired by the changes, began to feel proud of where they worked. A few weeks later, Taehyung returned to the hospital to check on how things were going. He walked through the halls, observing the transformation. As he was about to leave, a small child ran up to him and grabbed his hand. Taehyung looked down and saw a 5-year-old boy with bright, curious eyes. Are you Kim Taehyung? The owner of the hospital? The boy asked. Taehyung smiled and knelt down to his level. Yes, that's me. The boy grinned shyly. Thank you for helping people. The doctors are nice now. Taehyung felt a lump in his throat. He gently ruffled the boy's hair. Taking care of people is what really matters. He stood up and gazed at the hospital illuminated against the night sky. Finally, he felt that his vision was becoming reality. Respect and compassion were free, but the lack of them came at a great cost.